Okay, good day. It's September 18th, 2020. My name is Eric Larson. I'm the president of the Shrewsbury Historical Society. Before we begin our lecture, could we have a minute of silence for 5 members of the Shrewsbury Historical Society who passed away this summer? Bonnie O'Brien, George Dakota, Bob LeBear, John Schwartz, and Ralph Kimball. Could you have 1 minute? Okay, next, could we go on with our treasurer's report? Thank you.
I'm Chris Gustafson, Vice President, and I'll be reading the treasurer report from Ann Folan. Ann reported that our finances are in order. 2 scholarships were awarded to high school seniors. Donations were made to Old Sturbridge Village and to the Shrewsbury Town Center Association for Light the Common. A portion of the lawn and all of the stone walls at the 1830 Brick School were repaired. The lawns at the 1830 Brick School and the number 5 schoolhouse have been maintained throughout the summer. This is also a friendly reminder that dues can be mailed to us at any time during the month of September. Membership forms are in the September newsletter and online at our website. Dues are only $10. New members are always welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we go on, we need to have a curator's report. You could speak a little bit about that.
Curator Linda Davis reported that, like other town-owned buildings, we're closed to the public due to COVID-19. We continue to receive lots of treasures, though, including extensive Shrewsbury family genealogy and research conducted by Bob Cormier. This significant donation was made by Carol Cormier. We're very grateful. The Shrewsbury High School History Club donated a DVD with interviews from 3 of Shrewsbury's World War II veterans, and Selco donated a book about their first 100 years. There are also several email requests for history-related information.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we begin our program, I also want to say happy 100th birthday to Mary Layden. She was born up, she lived up at Juniper Hall for quite a long time. She's a member of the society. Also, for our program today, we could give attention to Songs of the Revolution by Diane Taras. This program explores the wide variety of music enjoyed by all classes of people as seeds of the revolution develop into the revolution developed into the Civil War. She has presented Songs of the Revolution at museums and historical societies throughout Massachusetts. Thank you very much, Diane.
Well, hello, welcome. I'm going to do lots of songs from the 1700s, more than 250 years ago, when music was everywhere, doing more than it does for us today. Today, music is mainly entertainment, but back then people sang while they worked. The lullaby has been called perhaps the world's oldest work song. Songs with a driving beat helped speed work while you were churning butter or chopping wood, spinning thread, plowing fields, tending livestock, washing clothes, stirring puddings, on and on. Hymns rang out in churches where people attended 2 services each Sunday, in the morning and in the afternoon. Soldiers marched to military tunes and lovers sang passionate songs. Dancing was a major pastime, to jigs and reels and waltzes. No, not waltzes yet, sorry. Forget the waltzes, that was later. And when the sun went down, a long, long ballad could pass the time away, the evening, as you listened to a long story that unfolded in your imagination. There are some old ballad books with verses, with songs that have 60 or 80 verses to them, because it was like a movie that you could listen to. And of course, there was no recorded music. If you wanted music, you had to make it yourself. And people in the American colonies sang English ballads and Welsh hymns and Scottish songs and Irish melodies. And here's one song that they took from a London ballad opera in 1728. Most of the music in the colonies, of course, came from England, and a lot of it from theater in London. And this is called Use the Season. Use the season made for joys. Love is then our duty. She alone who that employs well deserves her beauty. Let's be gay while we may. Beauty's a flower despised in decay. Use the season made for joys. Love is then our duty. Let us drink and sport today. Ours is not tomorrow. Love with youth flies swift away. Age is not but sorrow. Dance and sing, time's on the wing. Life never knows the return of spring. Let us drink and sport today. Ours is not tomorrow. And this instrument is as close as I can get to what a woman would have played in colonial times. There were guitars with gut strings known as Spanish guitars, but they were mostly played by sailors and rowdy guys in bars. But the refined young woman of some wealth might have what was called an English guitar, which was kind of like a lute with a long neck. Classical music was revered and preserved, but folk songs were spread just by being sung. And for those who could not read or had little access to newspapers, ballads spread the news of the day and served as propaganda in political struggles, as we will hear. And old songs passed on the wisdom of the generations. Here's another one from the Beggar's Opera, which was called that because instead of classical songs, it had over 60 folk songs that they had written new words for, but everyone knew dozens of melodies back then. And here's In the Days of My Youth. They were much concerned with youth. In the days of my youth, I could bill like a dove. Fa la 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 dee. In the days of my youth, I could bill like a dove, like a sparrow at all times was ready for love. Fa la 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 dee, fa la 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 dee, fa la 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 dee. The life of all mortals in kissing should pass. Fa la 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 dee. The life of all mortals in kissing should pass. Lip to lip when you're young, then the lip to the glass. Fa la 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 dee, fa la 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 dee, fa la 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 dee. And this is a dulcimer, which comes from the Appalachian Mountains. It's known as a mountain dulcimer or an Appalachian dulcimer. And it was around in colonial times, but probably not in New England. But the sound of it is, I think, very much like an English guitar with its wire strings. And that song has that wonderful verse, "As the life of all mortals in kissing should pass." We should be kissing all the time, lip to lip when you're young, then the lip to the glass. Because there were no painkillers other than alcohol. And in fact, man, woman, and child in colonial times drank lots and lots of alcoholic drinks, especially cider. And they did it because water supplies were known to be dangerously polluted most of the time. And alcoholic drinks were healthy and didn't need refrigeration. And they preserved your bounty of apples or your wheat made into beer. And people salted and dried and pickled and made cheese and butter to save food for later because they did not have refrigeration. Religion was a huge part of life back then. As I said, there were 2 services every Sunday. And music in church was unaccompanied or maybe with 1 instrument, and there were no hymnals. The leader sang a line and the congregation repeated it. And I have read that the style was to sing as loud as you possibly could so that God could hear your voice rising up into the heavens. In fact, there are some articles that try to tone down New England penchant for screeching the hymns. Well, here's one of many hymns they sang back then. And this one actually is still sung in a lot of churches today. It's called How Firm a Foundation. And it really captures the way people viewed life. Life was a vale of tears. God sent trials to make you a better person. That was the purpose of suffering. It had a meaning. It was to improve your character, to burn away your imperfections, just as burning gold removes the base metals, the dross. The words to this are by John Keith in 1787. And in it, God does not say you will not suffer. In fact, he guarantees that you will suffer right from teething to old age, but you will not be alone. He will be with you and give you strength. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he hath said, who unto the Savior for refuge has fled? When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, his grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not harm thee, his only design, thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. Even down to old age, all my people shall prove my gracious, eternal, unchangeable love. And when hoary hairs shall their temples adorn, like lambs they shall still in my bosom be born. Of course, there are many more verses. Everything I'm going to sing has many more verses, but we don't have as much time as they used to. And the lack of a rhyme, when you come across one of these old songs where the words don't rhyme, that is not an oversight. They made things rhyme very religiously. It's an indication that words were pronounced very differently. In there, we have the word prove rhymed with the word love. I think they said Louvre back then, so prove and Louvre rhymed. I mean, we run into this all the time. And everyone, as I mentioned, knew many, many melodies, and the good ones got many sets of words. In London and elsewhere, ballad writers churned out cheap broadsides. They would print the words on a big piece of paper and say, there weren't any notes, because that would be very hard to print. So they said, sing this to the tune of Drake's Drum, or whatever it might be. Now in 1773, John Newton, ship captain, and who had been a slave trader, ran into a storm at sea and promised God that if he were spared, he would reform his ways. People always do this, but in this case, Mr. Newton did indeed reform his ways. And he wrote a hymn about how he was saved from being a wretch who sold other people and instead was saved by an amazing grace. And that was the name of his poem. Newton did not write any music at all for Amazing Grace, and it was set to a lot of different tunes until the early 1800s. So in colonial times, one of the first tunes that his words appear with is called Tisbury, and here's how it goes. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see, was blind, but now I see, was blind, but now I see, was blind, but now I see. In glorious four-part harmony. Totally different feel to the song. And it shows it comes from a time when people didn't have hymnals. So when you get to that last line, well, let's sing it a few times together. The melody that we so love attached to these words arose in the early 1800s. It's not really clear where from. It probably has Scottish roots, and it definitely has African-American roots. Well, during the 1750s, colonists fought as good British subjects against the French and their Indian allies. And George Washington was a colonel in the British Army during the French and Indian War. And he no doubt knew and marched to this British regimental song, proudly marched to since 1678. It's called the British Grenadiers. And it invokes the heroes of the past, Alexander and Hercules. But it says, oh, we have better weapons than they had, because a grenadier was a soldier who threw a grenade, a little bomblet, a little hand grenade. His job was to run up to the glacis, the area in front of the fort, and hurl his grenade over the parapets. By the time of the colonial era, 100 years later, marksmanship had improved. So the grenadiers no longer did this because they would have been shot immediately, but they remained the grenadiers. And here's their song. Some talk of Alexander and some of Hercules, of Hector and Lysander and such great names as these. But of all the world's great heroes, there's none that can compare with a tow-row-row and a row-row-row to the British Grenadiers. Those heroes of antiquity never saw a cannonball, or knew the force of powder to slay their foes withal. But our brave boys do know it and banish all their fears. Sing a tow-row-row and a row-row-row for the British Grenadiers. Oh, when we are commanded to storm the palisades, our leaders march with fuses and we with hand grenades. We throw them from the glacis about the enemy's ears. Sing a tow-row-row and a row-row-row for the British Grenadiers. And when the siege is over, we to the town repair. The townsmen cry, hurrah, boys, here comes a grenadier. Here come the grenadiers, me boys, who know no doubts or fears. Sing a tow-row-row and a row-row-row for the British Grenadiers. One of the most horrifying facts from this time is that footwear did not come in lefts and rights, just one shape. And British soldiers were advised to swap their boots weekly so that they wouldn't run crooked. I can't imagine anyone doing that once you've gotten them shaped to your feet, but that's what they advised. Well, one British officer in the French and Indian War was kind of disgusted by the ragtag Yankees he had to serve alongside. And he wrote a song poking fun at them. He used a very old melody called The Air from Who Knows Where. And it's a slightly different melody than the one we're used to. This was back in the 1750s. And here's what he wrote. Yankee Doodle went to town a-riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Very familiar song, but most people do not know what the macaroni thing is all about. A macaroni was a gigantic Italian wig with lots of curls that looked like you dumped a bowl of pasta on your head. And it was worn by extremely fashionable young men on the continent and in England. Men wearing silk and lace and velvet and probably powder and maybe a little lipstick too. Men were peacocks back then if they wanted to be. And so the name for the wig became attached to the young man who's encrusted in finery. And the joke is that this doodle, this Yankee Doodle, who's a silly person, thinks he's the height of fashion because he's stuck a turkey feather in his cap, that he's just as fancy as a macaroni. Here's a little bit more of that original song. Brother Ephraim sold his cow and bought him a commission, and then he went to Canada to fight for the nation. But when Ephraim, he came home, he proved an arrant coward. He wouldn't fight the Frenchmen there for fear of being devoured. Well, during the 1760s, in the decade after the French and Indian War, a song arrived in the colonies. It had been in a London play called High Life Below Stairs. And the plot was that this master disguises himself as one of his servants to spy on them and see if they're cheating him. And of course, they are. And hilarity ensues. There's one song in this play, and it's called Come Here, Fellow Servant. And the song indicates that we all serve something. Even those who think they're wearing finery are really in livery, which was servants' clothing. We're all in a livery. And this song became very, very popular in the colonies because it was about liberty and equality, evolving past England's rigid social structure. So here's a few verses of Come Here, Fellow Servant, a tankard waver if ever there was one. Come here, fellow servant, and listen to me. I'll show you how those of superior degree are only dependents, no better than we, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. Nature made all alike, no distinction she craves. So we laugh at the great world, its fools and its knaves, for we are all servants, but they are all slaves, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. The gay sparkling belle who the whole town alarms, and with eyes, lips, and neck sets the smarts all in arms, is a vassal herself, a mere drudge to her charms, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. So we'll drink like our betters, and laugh, sing, and love, and when sick of one place, to another we'll move. For with little and great, the best joy is to rove, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. 'Tis here, fellow servant, and there, fellow servant, and all in a livery. That last verse is quite amazing. It says, we'll drink like our betters and laugh, sing, and love. Yes, some people are better than others, but we can all laugh and sing and love. And when sick of one place, to another we'll move. That personifies the American character. We've been moving for 250 years. For with little and great, the best joy is to rove. You can practically hear the motorcycles revving in that last verse. Well, gentlemen love to gather at clubs to drink and sing and smoke and drink coffee, which was a fairly new, exciting development. And there's a club in London that still exists called the Enochrion Club. And it is devoted to Enochrion, who was a Greek poet who was known for his odes, to wine and to love, two subjects dear to the heart of your average gentleman. And in the 1760s, two members wrote a song called To Enochrion in Heaven, asking the poet to be their sponsor and protect them from the thunderbolts of Apollo, and Jove, who were concerned that the goddesses would all go down and party with these guys at Rowley's in London. There's a lot of verses to it with all kinds of Greek mythology, but I'm going to give you just the first verse because I think you will find the melody rather interesting. To Enochrion in heaven, where he sat in full glee, and a few sons of harmony made a petition that he their inspirer and patron would be. When this answer arrived from the jolly old Grecian, voices, fiddle, and flute should no longer be mute. I'll lend ye my name and inspire ye to boot. And besides, I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine. Yes, the melody to our national anthem, which came about because, as I said, good melodies got lots of different lyrics if people liked them. This melody made its way from London to the colonies and spread all over the place, and people wrote new words for it. And Francis Scott Key in the War of 1812 wrote the words to the Star Spangled Banner. He actually used it once before that as well. So, and today we think that words and music just stick together like glue, but back then things were kind of up in the air. Well, England built up a huge debt defending its colony, New England, from the French and the Indians. And they reasoned that who better to pay the taxes to retire those debts than the colonists? But of course, the colonists didn't see it that way. They were upset that they had no say in Parliament where the taxes were levied. And when the Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed things like paint and glass and tea, the colonists mounted a 2-year boycott of everything made in England. And the colonies were a major market for things made in England. So this caused a lot of economic hardship and turmoil. And this was a song that appeared in the Boston Newsletter, another thing that sounds kind of modern to us, but it was called the Boston News-Letter in 1769, and it's promoting the boycott. It's called Young Ladies in Town. It's not concerned with people in the country because they don't really consume much embroidered goods, but those young ladies in town are wearing silks and ribbons and consuming tea and whatnot. So in the second verse, it says, as one agree, you'll not married be to such as will wear London factory. Don't entertain any proposals of marriage unless the fellow is keeping the boycott. It's an interesting tactic to propose. And then it says, throw away your bohea, which was a kind of imported tea, and your green hyson tea. And the fact that tea rhymes with bohea as tea shows that people said, have a cup of tea, just the way the Irish do now. And instead, you're supposed to drink Labrador, which was brewed from an evergreen bush, also known as Indian tea. So here's Young Ladies in Town. Young ladies in town, and those that live around, wear none but your own country linen. Of economy boast, let your pride be the most, to show clothes of your own make and spinning. If homespun, they say, be not quite as gay as brocades, be not in a passion. For once it is known, 'tis much worn in town, one and all will cry out, 'tis the fashion. And as one agreed, you'll not married be to such as will wear London factory. At first sight refuse, pray tell them you'll choose to encourage our own manufactory. No more ribbons wear, nor in rich silks appear. Love your country much better than fine things. Begin without passion, 'twill soon be the fashion to grace your smooth locks with a twine string. Throw away your bohème and your green hyacinth, and all things of a new fashion beauty. Get in a good store of the choice Labrador, there will soon be enough here to suit ye. Please do without fear, and to all you'll appear fair, charming, true, lovely, and clever. Though times remain darkish, young men will be sparkish and love you much stronger than ever. Well, the next year, in 1768, British troops were sent to occupy the troublesome town of Boston. And they didn't really build a lot of barracks. They said, as good subjects of the king, the residents of Boston should put these soldiers up. And the men were poorly paid and didn't get all that much in food. So they hired themselves out for menial jobs at very low wages, enraging the unemployed of Boston. Does this sound familiar to anyone? And there were street fights and friction, and mobs and children taunted the troops. Bloody backs, lobster backs. And Sam Adams and his Sons of Liberty fanned the flames. Dr. Joseph Warren was on the Committee of Safety of the Sons of Liberty, and he sent Paul Revere riding all over the colonies carrying messages. In 1770, a mob attacked some British soldiers in Boston with snowballs and rocks, and the soldiers fired, and this was the Boston Massacre. And Paul Revere made a famous engraving that so inflamed Bostonians that the British were no longer safe staying in houses. So they retreated to Castle Island, which at the time was an island. Now it's a peninsula off of South Boston. And while they were there, they wrote some threatening verses saying they were going to come back with reinforcements and burn the place down. If you visit the old State House in Boston, you can see an original broadside of this, which is called the Castle Island Song. And of course, they didn't write new music. They picked an old melody called the Dreadnought. And in it, they say, King Hancock, making fun of John Hancock, King Hancock better watch out. He might get the yaws, which was an icky skin disease. But don't worry, they said. We have a cure. We'll give him a hard pill. And I do believe they meant a lead bullet. So here's the Castle Island Song. And you should imagine I'm a disgruntled British Grenadier camping out. I believe it was March. It was not comfortable there. So they're grouchy. Oh, and they mentioned half a score, and a score is 20, so half a score would be 10. You simple Bostonians, I'd have you beware of your liberty tree. I would have you take care, for if we should chance to return to the town, Your houses and stores will come tumbling down, derry down, 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 derry down. If you'll not agree to obey England's laws, I fear that King Hancock may soon get the yaws. But he need not fear, for I swear we will. For the want of a doctor, give him a hard pill. Derry down, 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 derry down. A brave reinforcement we soon think to get, and then we will make you poor pumpkins to sweat. Our drums they will rattle, and then you will run to the devil himself at the sight of a gun. Derry down, 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 derry down. Our fleet and our army, they soon will arrive, and to a bleak island you shall not us drive. In every house you shall have 3 or 4. If that doesn't please you, you'll have half a score. Derry down, 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 derry down. Well, that same year, 1770, Joseph Warren wrote some verses. He wrote 9 or 10, I believe. Most people start with verse 4 because it's obviously the best one. He was a doctor and a patriot, not so much a songwriter. But he was urging revolt, and he looked to a future day when the fleets of England, France, and Spain will tremble at the sound of America. We didn't even have a navy at this time, so people probably thought he was a little nuts. But to drive home his rebellious point, he chose a melody that everyone would recognize. He chose the British Grenadiers. He chose the British's proudest marching song to write rebellious words. Lift up your hands, ye heroes, and swear with proud disdain. The wretch that would ensnare you shall lay his snares in vain. Should your bounty all her force will meet her in array, and fight and shout and shout and fight for free America. Torn from a world of tyrants beneath this western sky, we formed a new dominion, our land of liberty. The world shall own we're freemen here, and such will ever be. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for free America. Some future day shall crown us the masters of the main. Our fleet shall speak in thunder to England, France, and Spain. Nations o'er the ocean spread shall tremble and obey the prince who rules by freedom's laws in North America. So Warren looked ahead. He didn't know we'd have a president. He said, we'll have a prince who rules by freedom's laws. Well, in 1775, Warren sent Paul Revere to Lexington to warn Sam Adams and John Hancock that troops were coming to arrest them. And the next morning, April 19th, we had the battle on Lexington Green. And during the long march back from Boston to Lexington, then to Concord, and the long retreat back, British fifers and drummers no doubt played the British Grenadiers to help keep the weary troops going. But another song was mentioned in the newspaper the next day. The next day, April 20th, a Boston paper wrote, upon their return to Boston, one Briton asked his brother officer how he liked the tune now. Dang them, he replied, they made us dance it till we were tired, since which Yankee Doodle sounds less sweet to their ears. So the British had been playing Yankee Doodle to make fun of colonists for 20 years or so, but this was a new version with many irreverent verses adopted as a marching song by those it was originally meant to insult. And it got lots of verses. None of them had the slightest political content, really. But here's a couple just to give you a feeling for it. First we take a pinch of snuff and then a drink of water, and then we say, how do you do? And that's a Yankee supper. It's gonna leave you kind of hungry, that supper. Sheep's head and vinegar, buttermilk and tansy. Boston is a Yankee town, sing Yankee Doodle dandy. Our Jemima's lost her mare and can't tell where to find her, but she'll come trotting by and bring her tail behind her. Two and two may go to bed, two and two together, and if there is not room enough, lie one atop the other. Now that last verse, probably inspired by the fact that when you traveled and stayed at an inn, you seldom got your own bed. You would share a bed with fellow travelers. But it also may refer to the New England practice of bundling. A visitor courting a daughter might be unable to return home. Darkness or weather might come upon them. They would allow the young man to sleep in the same bed with his sweetheart as long as they had their clothes on, and they often put a board between them under the sheets. And the fact that this didn't work very well is indicated by an amazing statistic that over 40% of brides in New England in the late 1700s were pregnant when they got married. Now, this was not considered a big social problem. Church leaders didn't like it, but most people considered it a good omen if the woman was pregnant. It showed she was fertile and the union would be blessed with children. The only problem arose was if they didn't get married, and this was called breach of promise. And for the next 100 years or so, you could be brought to court for breach of promise. If you promised to marry someone and became formally engaged, and then you didn't marry them, and especially if they became pregnant, it was a matter for the courts. Well, the Battle of Bunker Hill was 2 months after Lexington Green. And unfortunately, Dr. Joseph Warren died, so he never got to see the fruits of his labors. The British won that battle, but suffered great losses. They especially lost over 100 officers. And losing an officer was a big problem because British soldiers were trained to obey, but not think for themselves. So without an officer, they really didn't know what to do. And to get a new officer, you had to send word all the way back to England across the Atlantic on a ship, get him trained, get him ready to go, bring him back across the ocean. So the colonists learned to aim for the officers, and the officers quickly got down off their horses and took the insignia off their uniforms in many cases because they knew this was the tactic. It was considered very unsporting and unchivalrous. It was very effective. Well, inspired by these battles, over 20,000 armed men from all over New England gathered in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And on July 3rd, 1775, George Washington took command of the Continental Army. There have been many wonderful books written about history, and one in particular, Washington's Crossing by David Hackett Fisher, really stresses the amount of difficulty poor Washington had leading an army of amateur soldiers against the skilled regular troops of the British Army. Washington was a Virginia gentleman. His plantation had hundreds of slaves. He considered New England a foreign place. He was appalled by undisciplined Yankees whose officers were casual and indifferent to rank. He complained about the leveling spirit of New England, where the principles of democracy so universally prevail. You can hear his nose going up when he says that. New England regiments were the most literate in the world. Nearly all privates could read and write. And a regiment from Marblehead reflected a New England maritime town. Indians and Africans were accepted if they could do the job just as on a ship. And they showed up on Cambridge Green with their fellow fighters. And regiments from elsewhere disapproved, and Washington didn't like it either. But by the end of the war, African Americans were being actively recruited, and some rose to the rank of colonel in New England regiments. The Continental Army was the first integrated national institution in the United States. Washington also had to deal with regiments from the back country of Pennsylvania and Virginia, crack shots with their long rifles. Their rattlesnake flags show that their idea of liberty was personal. Don't tread on me. There were also troops from Philadelphia sent by pacifist Quakers called associators. They elected their officers and wore simple uniforms with no rank. And the silk stocking regiments were private groups with their own flamboyant uniforms. And they would ride up on their horses and say, "Here we are, General Washington." And even privates expected to be treated as gentlemen. And they expected to be able to resign and go home if anything displeased them. Washington's greatest achievement was forming this wild mix of Americans into a force that could be directed against an implacable enemy. Well, a soldier's life could be very hard, especially when there was no government yet to support him. And American colonists had no uniforms, they brought their own guns, and had no supplies to replace things that wore out. So shoeless American soldiers starved and froze in rags, most famously at Valley Forge. But here's a rather lighthearted song that reflects that rather harsh reality. It's called "Soldier, Will You Marry Me?" And it kind of points out the poverty of your average soldier and also his essential nature. So here, soldier, will you marry me? Soldier, soldier, will you marry me with your musket, fife, and drum? Oh, how can I marry such a pretty girl as you when I have no hat to put on? Off to the haberdasher she did go as fast as she could run. She bought him a hat, the best one there, and the soldier put it on. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me with your musket, fife, and drum? Oh, how can I marry such a pretty girl as you when I have no coat to put on? Off to the tailor she did go as fast as she could run. She bought him a coat, the best one there, and the soldier put it on. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me with your musket, fife, and drum? Oh, how can I marry such a pretty girl as you when I have no boots to put on? Off to the cobbler she did go as fast as she could run. She bought him a pair, the best ones there, and the soldier put them on. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me with your musket, fife, and drum? Oh, how can I marry such a pretty girl as you with a wife and a baby back home? Oh, she's working so hard. Well, among the soldiers who gathered to fight were slaves from various colonies. Washington had a personal slave by his side throughout the war. His name was William Lee. And he was a friend and companion who matched Washington in horsemanship and daring. They loved to race through the countryside, leaping over logs. And Lee wore an exotic turban. Washington called him "my fellow." And after the war, George gave William his freedom. If you visited a military camp at this time, you would see a surprising number of women and children. An important part of the army were camp followers, women who lived and worked alongside the soldiers. Some were indeed prostitutes who were attracted by the steady paychecks of the soldiers, but most of them were the wives or sweethearts or daughters of the soldiers. The army didn't have the support system it has today, and these women did the cooking, they washed clothes, and they nursed the wounded, and many received a small wage and a half ration of food. And when British troops sailed for America, they held a lottery to see who could bring their wife or daughter their support system. Joseph Plum Martin, a Connecticut private, joined as a teenager, and he later wrote a memoir of his time in the Continental Army. It's a long story of essentially starvation, spending most of his time scrounging food or firewood or warm clothing. At one point, he's sick and thin. He goes home on leave, fattens up on mom's cooking, and then he goes back, and you want to yell at him, Joseph, what are you doing? But he believed in the cause. And back then, that meant putting up with things that people just would not today. Martin fought in the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey on June 28, 1778, the largest one-day battle of the war. 13,000 Americans faced 10,000 British, and it was over 100 degrees. Martin saw women bringing water to the troops who would call, a pitcher, Molly, I need a pitcher, Molly. And Martin wrote, a woman whose husband belonged to the artillery attended with her husband at the piece. This soldier's husband was right with him, helping him fire his cannon. While reaching for a cartridge, with one of her feet as far before the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed, it was lucky it did not pass a little higher. So camp followers did not always stay behind the lines when battles occurred. They would be right there with their husbands, bringing them water as the famous Molly pitchers would do. And this woman, whose name was Mary Hayes, George Washington made her a non-commissioned officer after this battle, and they called her Sergeant Molly. And in 1822, Pennsylvania granted her a yearly pension of $40, which was an amazing thing back then. Well, we have a wonderful source of the things people like to listen to in a notebook kept by a man who was a paymaster in the 11th Pennsylvania Regiment right through the war. His name was Captain George Bush. Now, he's not related to the presidential George Bushes because he apparently didn't leave any living children. But he kept a notebook where he copied songs from various sources, including a London magazine he subscribed to called The Songster's Companion. And apparently, it didn't matter that we were at war, his magazine still arrived by ship periodically, and he wrote down all these tunes. And here's a particularly interesting one. It's called Oh Say Bonnie Lass. And once again, it comes from a London play, and the characters are a Scottish soldier, and he is asking his sweetheart if she will become a camp follower, if she can follow him and lie in a barrack and carry his wallet, his knapsack with all of his money and tobacco and things. And then he says, will you come campaigning where we might have to starve a bit and freeze? And in the last verse, he says, will you go into battle? And he asks it rather casually. So it was obviously a common thing that if you were going to become a soldier's wife, you might find yourself in battle. So here's Oh Say Bonnie Lass, and he says, can you leave your mammy and daddy? And mammy is the way Scottish people still refer to their mothers. It has nothing to do with the later 19th century meaning of mammy. Oh, say, Bonnie lass, can you lie in a barrack and marry a soldier and carry his wallet? Oh, say, will you leave both your mammy and daddy and follow to the camp with your soldier laddie? Oh, yes, I will do it and think nothing of it. I'll marry my soldier and carry his wallet. Oh yes, I will leave both my mammy and daddy and follow to the camp with my soldier laddie. Oh, say, Bonnie lass, will you go a-campaigning? Endure all the hardship of famine and battle. When I'm wounded and bleeding, then wilt thou draw near me and kindly support me and tenderly cheer me. Oh, say, bonny lass, will you go into battle with drums are beating and cannon loud rattle? Oh yes, my dear lad, I will share all thy harms, and should thou be killed, I will die in thine arms. Of course, it's from a play, so she swears if anything happens to him, she'll just expire right on the spot from grief, which is what you do in a play. Well, in 1775, the governor of Virginia, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, was driven from office, and he set up a government on a ship in the James River. He was joined by hundreds of loyalists in a floating town of 200 ships with 3,000 people. Now, Dunsmore, one afternoon, got it into his mind to issue a proclamation, and this is what it said. All indentured servants, Negroes, or others that are able and willing to bear arms are invited to join His Majesty's troops. This was not a policy from King George or the British government, but word spread like wildfire that Dunsmore was offering freedom for any slave who would fight for Britain. And soon he had hundreds of runaways in his floating town. He organized them into Ethiopian regiments who fought with badges that said liberty to slaves. And among these runaways were some owned by 3 famous Virginians. There were several from Mount Vernon, including a man named Harry Washington. There were 24 from Monticello, owned by Thomas Jefferson. And there were several people who were enslaved by Patrick Henry, who, of course, in 1775 thundered, "Give me liberty or give me death." For these founding fathers, the idea of liberty was very limited. It applied only to those whose life circumstances suited them for liberty. Their life circumstances were a sign of the favor of God and their suitability. This basically was white men who owned land and were educated. Well, eventually some 20,000 runaway slaves joined the British side, about the same number of whites who joined loyalist regiments. But other slaves from New England went to war with their masters. One was the husband of a woman named Mum Bet. She was a slave in Massachusetts, and in 1781, 2 years before the war ended, she sued for her freedom in a Great Barrington court. She had heard the new Massachusetts state constitution read, proclaiming that all men were created equal. She won her case and was set free along with people in the household, and her case set a precedent that rather soon led to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. But Bet's husband never returned from war. He may have been killed. He may have fled to freedom in Canada. He may have joined the British side, for all we know. Back then, communications were extremely difficult, and you never often knew what happened to anybody who marched over the horizon. And here's a wonderful song called "Johnny Has Gone for a Soldier," which I'm sure Bet knew and many other women of the time knew. Here I sit on Buttermilk Hill, who can blame me, crime I feel, and every tear will turn on me. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Sure, 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 and he asks me when he comes back, will married be. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Me, I loved him so. for a soldier. Sure, 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 sure that he loves me. When he comes back with a merry beat, Johnny's gone for a soldier. I'll dye my dress, I'll dye it red, and through the streets I'll beg for bread. For the lad I love from me has fled. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Sure, 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 sure that he loves me. When he comes back with a merry beat, Johnny's gone for a soldier. Well, the peace treaty that ended the war did not keep Lord Dunsmore's promise. It said that no property shall be removed from the United States. And in a wonderful book called Liberty's Exiles, Maya Jasanoff details how when the British evacuated in 1783, they took about 55,000 loyalists who had no future in the new country. There were slave owners who wanted to keep their slaves, and runaway slaves who wanted to keep their freedom. Some wound up in England, some in Jamaica and other British colonies. And in New York City, British officials loaded ships with refugees bound for Nova Scotia. General Washington arrived to complain that property was leaving the United States in violation of the treaty. Among the evacuees were free blacks and hundreds of runaway slaves. But the British official replied, well, these people were free when I got here, and I have no reason to believe they are otherwise. One of these people who sailed away was Harry Washington, probably a field hand, someone with whom George did not have a personal relationship, unlike William Lee, whom he freed. Washington's views evolved through his life, but unlike Jefferson, he freed his slaves in his will. And that meant he took away his family's major wealth. That was the thing that kept people from freeing their slaves. They were the most valuable thing in the country, and without them, your plantation was not going to run. Well, after 8 long years, the Revolutionary War ended in 1783. Uncertainty and economic confusion followed. And many complained that the war had made servants unwilling to defer to their betters. In 1788, Massachusetts ratified the United States Constitution. Bells rang, cannons boomed, and yet more verses to Yankee Doodle appeared. 13, in fact, but I'm going to give you 2. It says, the vention did in Boston meet the convention. The State House could not hold them. I guess there were so many, they had to go to Federal Street. So this is my last song, and I want to thank so much the Historical Society for doing this. And I've had a great time here in my chamber, coming to you over this amazing, miraculous thing. I believe they call it Zoom. Or perhaps we're going to be on television. These things are unknown to me, but anyway, here comes my last song. The vention did in Boston meet, the State House could not hold 'em. So then they went to Federal Street, and there the truth was told 'em. Every morning went to prayer, and then began disputing, till opposition silenced were by arguments refuting. Now politicians of all kinds who are not yet decided may see how Yankees speak their minds and yet are not divided. So here I end my federal song composed of 13 verses. May agriculture flourish long and commerce fill our purses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The music was great. I know we can go on your website, Diane Taraz, and Songs of the Revolution is there. Thank you very much. Our next month's lecture will be Early Lighting Devices by Tom Kelleher. Most of the people from Shrewsbury Historical Society know Tom from many performances he's had at our place. That's October 24th, 2020. And thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope to see you next month.